Hi, everyone. I'd like to thank you for coming at this time of the day on an astrology conference in sunny Sedona. It's a sign of some dedication, I think, to come to a talk this late, so thank you. I'd like to thank Jeffrey and Stephen for making this possible. Thank you. So tonight I'm going to talk about a search for homeland, the cardinal axis, and this will be a precursor talk to my second talk, the water signs, the map of consciousness, extending from Cancer, from this idea of homeland we hope to create, to develop that further. I'd like to make this search for homeland both an internal and external journey. I think the key to it is that it's essentially an inside process. It's an inside step, and it's a choice we have to make, all of us. I'm just going to ground us a little bit with the cardinal axis. If I could have the picture of the cardinal axis, please. Yeah, great. Can we go? Okay, yes. With the cardinal axis, we're looking at the circle of the zodiac from Aries to Cancer to Libra to Capricorn. On one level, this is it. This is the whole deal right there and then. That's the medicine wheel. That's the circle of the zodiac. The sun rising in the east. The noon, the south point in the medicine wheel, the home of the child. The setting sun. The sun at midnight, as the great initiates called it, or the pole star, the guiding principle. In one sense, this is the structural entirety of the zodiac. And that's the point I'm going to keep coming back to in my talks. If we take the archetypal zodiac and we look at it from an evolutionary point of view, we can discover that the whole method makes sense and works just from that perspective and just from that understanding. So what's going on with Aries? This is the point we're born. This is the birth of every child. This is the birth of every moment. This is the birth of every astrology talk. Every moment we enter into conversation with someone, every moment we wake up. This is the birth point. And we're looking at this birth point at a fundamental reason for the underlying anxiety and insecurity in the cardinal axis. These are fundamentally insecure positions on one level. And that comes primarily from this birth aspect. The separation anxiety that ensues as we leave the womb, Cancer. This is the cause of so much. Kristen talked about the phases. Here we have the balsamic phase, the Pisces aspect. We come to Aries, we come out. We come out into this instinctual process. Lots of us don't want to come out. It's really nice in there, yeah? It's a lot simpler, and we're really loved. If we take this point here, and I know it's not marked with an icon, but this is the Scorpio point. And we can see a fundamental inconjunct between Scorpio, Pluto, and Aries, Mars. This is the other crisis. The soul, Scorpio, looks to here, to Pisces, to the all, but it also looks to come into particular movement, through a particular will, through a particular instinctual drive. They're very different feelings. They're very different desires, and they create a natural crisis point. Now, on a quite personal level in our charts, the ascendant can describe our birth on some level, and the way we birth ourselves into each moment. For example, a Scorpio rising, or in my case, a Pluto square, the ascendant, can have a certain degree of resistance to that entire process. Pluto resistance. In fact, in my chart, Pluto's in Virgo in the 9th house, retrograde in the last degree. And literally, my mum was belted to a bed in an old nursing home. And I was cut out while she was kind of crucified on this bed. And I'm a Pluto Virgo retrograde, square the Sag rising. You know, I was coming in straight away with my martyr struggle, resistance to coming here at all. And it's in this process, this birth process, that we find our instinctual power. And here's a great mistake made in a lot of astrology. Jeff made the very pertinent point last night that evolutionary astrology takes steps that are fundamentally different from the majority of traditional astrology. A lot of traditional astrologers see this as the persona, the entity we meet when we meet someone. We don't fully know them. In fact, this is the instinctual self as it manifests in its full intensity. The persona is generated by the projected response to that. It's a fundamental difference. So a Scorpio rising person with this resistance, all the women in my life are Scorpio rising. All of them, my girlfriend, my sister, several friends. They come across with this magnetic, brooding intensity. Sometimes people feel they're aloof, they're untouchable. But actually, when you connect with them, they're very self-contained. And when my girlfriend's is ruled by Venus in Pisces, really quite shy people. They don't get that sometimes. They only get it through feedback. They only get it because people come up to them and say, God damn it, you're intense. And this was the impact Jeffrey had coming to England in '99 to a bunch of professional astrologers sat around in someone's lounge in London. You know, some people were in suits. And Jeffrey came straight off the plane with no break. Cowboy boots, t-shirt, jeans. Came in, chewing some gum, sits down, crosses his legs, starts. A whole bunch of very Capricornian English people were kind of going, what's going on? Some never fully recovered. So this is the place of our instinctual intensity. It's a radically different perception than the projected needs that create a persona. Now, I'll just briefly, just to check in, just so we understand, take us on a little journey from Aries to Cancer here. If this is the birth, then at Taurus, this is the point where we begin to become aware of our needs, our essential self. This is where we become to try and internalize the anxiety caused by the birth and the separation. Psychologists call this object constancy. You go out playing in the garden, can you last 10 minutes before you become scared that mum is not there? Or have you begun to internalize that figure and play for longer? And it's the process of that becomes the internalization of the safety and the security. An afflicted Venus in Cancer, for example, can have real problems ever making that step, ever really internalizing. Here in Gemini, we begin to learn language skills, we begin to mimic. Children pick up, my young nephew picks up keys, goes vroom vroom, and fits them into different locks all over the house. We're mimicking everything. He mimics what his dad does. And then in Cancer, we come to the potential formation of our own emotional body. That's the key. And I'm going to make this the key in some senses to homeland. This is the psychological journey of these archetypes. I'm going to want today to focus both on the psychological journey. I'm going to look at these archetypes from a past life point of view. The multiple dimensions we're going to need to integrate reality. Now, in Cancer, another misconception of traditional astrology that evolutionary astrology alters is the location of the anima animus. I'm a man, inside me somewhere's a woman. There is. And if I can feel that connection to her, then I can really open up and liberate emotionally in my life. Whereas if I'm always walking around going, yeah, I'm just a guy. Yeah, you hurt me, but I'll smoke another cigarette. I'm limiting myself enormously, aren't I? I'm limiting myself. Whereas if I can open to this inner feminine figure inside me, then I can potentially emotionally liberate. And the same is true for women with their inner animus spirit. These are terms, by the way, from Carl Jung. Now, this figure is very, very important because we have this tendency to project this figure enormously. And this is the tension between Cancer and Libra. We project our needs. And we don't know we're doing it, at least half the time. If I can take an example of how this works on one level, let's imagine two people here. Billy and Jolene, we'll call them. Now, Billy's having a really good day. Yeah? He's on a roll. He's on a buzz. People seem to be finding him charismatic. He's talking. He's surprised. A lot of his self-consciousness has been overcome as a result, yeah? And he bumps into Jolene. And of course, she likes that. Most guys are so self-conscious around her. Most guys are just out to make a play. But this guy's having a great day. The instinctual attraction is there. And thus begins the process of projecting the anima animus. So let's say Billy, right? Basically, Billy likes to spend Friday night boozing with his friends. He likes to spend the weekend walking, hiking. He's just seen a great film that night. He's feeling buzzed up. He's talking about it, but he doesn't normally read that much or watch too many movies. Jolene, she likes to go shopping with friends on Saturday. She likes to check in the odd movie, feel up to date, feel hip to what's going on. But they've had this instinctual attraction. They start to project their anima animus onto the other in a positive way. And then they expect the subconscious compliance of the other. So maybe it's 6 months later when Jolene is out hiking with Billy for the 5th time, when she gets that pang of, I could have been with my friends, I could be shopping right now. Maybe she's just picked off another fly, that's bitten her out on the hillside, and she's thinking, why am I doing this? Or maybe Jolene started to get tired of the fact that Billy doesn't want to watch the films or go to the shows or read the magazines. Maybe Jolene says to Billy, well, you're not so culturally up on things, are you? God, I'm getting a bit frustrated with that. Maybe Billy's mother used to say that to him. Who knows? But it's going to snap for Billy. You're like all the other women. You don't take me seriously. You don't want to do what I want to do. You don't see me for who I am. We know all the pleas. We know the process. Yeah? And some people just go from relationship to relationship based on that instinctual attraction and projecting that anima animus through that. Time and time again. And if we start to add complex parental relationships, maybe in this example, Mum was a moon-square Jupiter who really wanted an education. Billy's mum. She really wanted an education to open her mind. And she wanted that for Billy. And she's fed up with him hiking around all the place, drinking with his friends. He should have gone to college. The boy should be reading. Jolene says it. Jolene says a version of that to Billy. And we know where that goes in. It goes in right here. That's what Mum said to Billy. The damage just goes on, the projection goes on, because we don't own that the figure is internal, that the anima resides inside me, and that the relationship needs to be formed in the double nature of the emotional body, Cancer. The dark and light side of the moon. The problems with some more traditional astrologers are that they locate Mars with the animus of the woman. But this is a tremendous relocation of power. Mars is our instinctual will, our instinctual self-assertion. To say that's only the male inside us robs people of power. The anima animus is a dialogue, a dyad inside our emotional body. It is not something that takes away our will. If it's owned internally, it's emotionally liberating. But for Billy and Jolene, who knows what happens? Maybe they learn from that. Or maybe Billy just waits for another good day to bump into the next Jolene. Yeah, it's tricky. So we reach this projected issue in relationships in Libra. Libra is a case of extremes. The inherent insecurity of the cardinal archetype manifests in Libra through extremes. Cycles of intense, multiple relationships, cycles of aloneness. This person's my soulmate. 6 weeks later, what was his name? Extremes. And yet the truth of Libra is this desire for justice, this desire for true listening, true giving, true receiving. So often, if the emotional body is unresolved, this remains an ideal rather than actuality. It's just pie in the sky. It'll be different next time. Yeah? Okay. So, psychologically, Capricorn, in one sense, represents the father. Or, more accurately, the level of parental activity that forms judgments, rules, laws, taboos in the family. I had a dream last night, actually. I'm a Moon Venus Capricorn. I had a dream last night with you in it, Stephen. And you were staring at me, kind of checking in that I could teach the basics of astrology, yeah? like a nice internal parent, you know? And I was going, yes, I can. You know, bravely, my Sag rising, I was going, yeah, I can do it. I really can. But that I'm having the dialogue at all tells you something about me. Moon, Venus, Capricorn, Saturn, skip step. I internalize those figures and I still need to dialogue with that figure. And here's the key, because if this figure is disowned in some way, if there is a cold father or a cold, judgmental upbringing, the child naturally seeks to make up the difference. Children are loving, innately loving. It's a natural law. And they will try to make up the difference for their parents. I mean, I see that a little bit in George Bush's chart, that whole Saturn Cancer in the 12, how he's trying to make up to daddy by what he's doing. You can even read the whole war as a make up to daddy, which just kind of shows you the impact of these kind of things. It's sad. He's like a little boy sometimes, isn't he? You know? Like a little boy in big boots. And he's a little boy with his finger on the button. Shit. Actually, and to follow on from Mr. Bush, Scott was very interestingly sharing geodetic material with us this morning. I've never come across that, but it's certainly interesting because it's a way of leading us into the past life archetypes involved here. A stern, judgmental father can translate on an archetypal level in prior life terms as a dysfunctional culture, as a stern, oppressive dominator culture, one that takes over other cultures violently. Violence, uses their soldiers to take over other lands. And in fact, through the Libra archetype, which I feel we can connect here to classical cultures, Rome and Greece. In the geodetic material, he linked several, Scott this morning, American presidents to the Roman Greek area. This was the center of civilization, this was the beginning of democracy, of the arts, of everything, but it was also a culture of extremes. The great flowering of democracy took place on the bed of slavery, of the forced reappropriation of other homes, of other lands. Raids into North Africa, raids into the tribes of Europe, and using aggression and, the greatest army in the world at that time to placate these peoples and to take them into use to help them build the great buildings of Rome. This is the legacy. This is the inheritance we have. And in fact, if you look in Bush's chart, I believe, I only looked at it this morning, South Node Sag in the 5th, ruled by Jupiter Moon Balsamic in the 3rd. We can see in Libra, the Jupiter Moon is in Libra. We can see that almost dynastic quality from that time that this man brings through. He's used to his family having power. He has memories of his family having power in those times. And he is acting as if those times are still real. He's walking around with that unconscious flow just coming through him, this balsamic dynastic connection. It's a feeling I've had about a number of American presidents, that there's this almost Roman view of the world. We'll come in there and we'll build our big straight roads straight through your sacred sites. The Romans were very clever like that. The Romans were not an unenlightened people. They knew you had to destroy the sacred sites of the lands you went into. They knew you had to build big stone roads straight through them, straight through the stone circles, straight through the greatest power points if you were going to claim that country. In fact, a number of dysfunctional cultures have used magic in this sense. I remember a Slovenian earth healer I worked with who was working around the Berlin Wall when it was still up. And he said there were layers on either side, like a kind of magic or resonance in the intention that was created around that. The Nazis are famous for their occult obsession. Funded through a dysfunctional Capricorn archetype, these cultures become incredibly aggressive. And we can see in charts, people with, a friend of mine has Pluto in Virgo in the 10th, and he has a second house Capricorn, ruled by Saturn in the 6th. We can clearly see through the Virgo and the Capricorn archetypes this persecutory intensity coming through those experiences. Diva was talking about the difference between the different types of guilt. Virgo is an acquired guilt through having had experiences where we are layered and injected time and time again with a message. If our culture is violently taken over and reappropriated, our homeland, and we are given message after message of our particular lowly status, of how we'll go and get the food, we'll get the water, we'll do that, it just internalizes a message over time. It's hard to resist that. Capricorn can correspond to an authentic guilt, really being aware of something that I've done and owning it. And therefore the mature Capricorn archetype becomes a very self-responsible person. Yes. So I'd like to just use one chart example to illustrate this past life dynamic. Thank you. The signature I'd really like us to look at, although we always start with Pluto, and here with a South Node conjunction, we're already aware of a repeat relive signature. And the 8th house, we know that this is to do with power versus powerlessness. This is a Saturn-Neptune conjunction, retrograde in the 10th house, opposing the Venus retrograde and the Sun, and T-squaring Uranus in Cancer. A number of people in this time, there was a generational signature of the Saturn-Neptune square the Uranus-Cancer. Uranus-Cancer always corresponds to a damage in the emotional body, a fracturing on the level of the inner child. But I'm also aware that with signatures like this, what I've started to see is this memory of a cultural reappropriation, of a forced reappropriation. And clearly with the Pluto South Node in the 8th house and the Venus retrograde, this person is going to meet people who share those experiences again. And actually we can see from the North Node that her intention, in part, is to realize the cause of this, to remember. A North Node Aquarius in the 2nd, to own as an internal resource her memory, her far memory of what happened. I'm not going to talk about this person greatly. I just want to highlight this type of example. This person was a Tai Chi teacher, an energy worker, you know, a relatively open person who had had a series of very, very painful relationship dynamics time and time again after very difficult parental relationships. Had had therapy, had had this, that, and the other. And our conversation was to try and source some of the grounds of this, some of the roots in these experiences. And we can see also with Saturn moving into Leo and coming up to these points, that this opportunity, because with Pluto at the South Node, we always have a repeat relive that can take a long time in a person's life to come out. The second Saturn return, often. That's why it's nice to meet someone when they're close to that point. You know, it's quite sad sometimes as an astrologer to face a young person with a Pluto South Node. Very difficult repeat relive. Here, this person is at a time when there is hope for them to put some of those issues down. But this generational signature, there may be people in this room that have it right now. I see as having a potential through Capricorn. For me, slavery is a Pisces or Virgo dynamic. You're put down or you're enslaved as a collective. But the enslavers are a Capricorn dynamic. It's a dysfunctional use of power and authority to put other people under your will. And here with the Neptune signature in Libra, we have the Pisces component brought in through Neptune. Through the 10th house, the dysfunctional culture. The Libra, more than likely Roman Greece, as some of the source of these experiences. Another thing about Neptune in the 10th house is that these people can then cycle through internal states of incredible meaninglessness and despair. They basically lose it inside on a regular basis. And yet, paradoxically, can become enormously helpful for other people as a result. There's a real sense of a guiding light for this person and people in their life. But this terrible personal pain about intimacy and belonging. Okay. Can we go back to the Aries, Cancer, Libra, Capricorn? Thanks. Great. So, structurally, this map. In ancient Britain, for example, in the spring festivals, there would be this enormous conceiving, this conception time. People would literally rip their clothes off and run in the fields. And this was symbolic of the spring, of the time of gestation to birth the king. Christ at Christmas, even though we may look into Christ as a Pisces himself, symbolically, through the world, it has been known in a Capricorn time. Capricorn is a very complex archetype. To hold this idea of the king is to show the homage that the ancient peoples had for this kind of winter solstice archetype. And I don't want to lose that, because whilst Capricorn can correspond to guilt, to grief, to dysfunctional cultures who impose their will on others, and we're going to talk about that a little more in a while, Capricorn psychologically often has this real desire to just, to come out, to liberate, to risk holding the child inside. A Mars Capricorn person will often have a real conscious will to break out of bondage. A Venus Capricorn person like myself secretly longs to break out. Yes, my Venus went through all sorts of conditioning, parental, societal, but deep down inside Capricorn, there's this innate desire for chaos. And sometimes I feel the control that Capricorns get into is simply to try and hold that chaos off. They're so aware of it that they go ever more rigid to make sure it doesn't come in, because it's so scary and overwhelming. And there's a big difference between an open and liberated Capricorn archetype and a closed one. A closed one will be as hard as hell. And I know when I go off center, I have to curl up in a tight ball in bed. I have to hold myself all over to feel again. Just on a personal level, I was traveling with a friend before we came here. We traveled through Vegas, where I learned to taste margaritas. We traveled to Zion National Park in Utah. And my friend had been driving a long time. And we went for a bit of a walk up the hill. He was tired, he wanted to go and sit in the car and have a beer. And I'd reached this spot, kind of away from everyone, under this enormous sort of watchtower mountain. No one around. The top comes off slowly, I'm lying on the floor, belly in the sun. This is nice, I'm feeling. But it's not quite enough. I'm looking around. And the rest starts to come off. But I'm a Moon, Venus, Capricorn, yeah? I'm checking the path every 5 seconds, yeah? The wind went in the bush, and I thought it was someone coming, and I was just... It took me a good 10 minutes to get to the point where I was comfortable. And then I just took a walk down through the mud, through the bushes. There was a little river and the boulder, and I just walked around like that because I wanted to, because it felt right inside. But I had to go through that little armored stage, that little fear and paranoia that someone would come around the corner and arrest me. Punish me for being skinny, white, and British. And I didn't want that, you know? Instead, my Sag rising, it's Moon, Venus, and Capricorn in the first, Sag rising. It was an instinctual act. It was my instinctual body. It was my sensuality, my instincts that wanted to have that experience, that wanted to wander like people would have wandered thousands of years ago before we started getting so hung up about these things. But I have to go through my personal hang-up each time, Moon, Venus, Capricorn. I have to go through what my remembered experience was, which was that it was not okay. So there's this innate desire for chaos in Capricorn, to break through. There's a wonderful moment in a film called Wings of Desire by Wim Wenders. And all these long-haired, tied-back-haired angels in dark coats are walking through Berlin. And they're the guardian angels of these people, and they particularly like to hang out in the library because it's quiet. And this one angel starts to really fall for someone. And he takes his friend aside, and he's basically going, I want to feel the weight of being on the earth. The weight. I want to feel the gravity. I want to take part in it. It's the complete antithesis of Maurice's biological transcendence with Uranus when it comes to Saturn. This is an archetype that wants to feel the weight. They want to feel it. Like Rilke said in a poem, taste the orange, dance the orange. If we eat something, if we're fully immanent, that's a form of transcendence. This is the gravity of the Capricorn archetype. These two angels, and this particular angel, he actually leaves his angelic form to meet this lady, just outside a Nick Cave concert, oddly enough. But. And they have this storyteller in this film, this storyteller, an old blind man. He describes himself as both ancient and young, an integration of the Capricorn archetype with the Cancer archetype. And he's stood by the wall in a desolate, derelict area, and he's saying, if only we could see through the passes and the cracks and walk through that, there would be no war. That's one of the lines from the film. This, again, to me, is a commentary on the liberated Capricorn archetype. If you could allow the crack and step through it, there would be no more war. In the history of our times, we find the Cancer and Capricorn archetypes hold the planetary nodes of Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto. Three of the big uns, three big guns, moving through south nodes in Capricorn to north nodes in Cancer. Pluto, Saturn, Jupiter. Saturn, Capricorn is the way we structure our consciousness. Pluto is the deep-seated urges, impulses, unconscious desires emanating from the soul that bring us into life after life. Jupiter, our beliefs. They all stem South Node Capricorn, North Node Cancer. If we take Jeffrey's teachings on the ages, we find that each age has a sub-age. So the Cancer age, beginning about 8,000 years BC, has a sub-age around 6,500 years BC, roughly. The Capricorn sub-age. Now, there are anthropologists writing today, and someone that Jeffrey turned me on to, Rianne Eisler, is particularly good. Her books, The Chalice and the Blade and Sacred Pleasure. And she writes of the growth of Kurgan tribes in Europe at that time, 7,000, 6,000 BC. They begin to come together. And they begin to invade other lands, living in a primarily echoes of a matriarchal culture. And they begin to impose violence, and then the law of the father. And we get the whole issue then about who has sired the children, who will be my seed, who will be my successor. These are Capricorn issues, patriarchal lineage, which can be a beautiful thing. You think of those old monks up in the caves in India and Nepal who've passed down the same flame of initiation to another, to another. It's gone down 800 years, 900 years. Patriarchal lineage. Can be a beautiful thing. But even those same monks may be bound to strict rules around the place of women in their monastery. I remember one famous man, a Lama Yeshe, who brought lots of the Tantric Buddhist teachings to the West. He had a student who was his heart disciple, who he'd cared for since a teenager. But whenever he went into rooms to address people, he had to sit lower than his student, his heart disciple. Because in his previous life, he'd been an abbess. He'd been the female head of a nunnery. And in the Tulku lineage, his heart disciple was seen to have come from a stronger patriarchal lineage. So he had to show respect to him, even though he was his teacher. So patriarchal lineage can have both good and bad points. But let's be clear, its violent reappropriation of the matriarchy and matriarchal cultures has caused a profound damage in our world today and throughout the last few thousand years of history. And we are almost used to it. We are used to the guys with the big guns running the show. And there's almost this complacency, this acceptance of that. I'll just show a brief chart example of these issues, if I may. Chart 1, please. So, in this chart again, an 8th house Pluto with the Sun in Leo. And here we see a complex signature across the nodes, where the ruler of the South node is conjunct the North node, and the ruler of the North node is conjunct the South node. That which facilitated the past is right up there in the intended direction. And that which is going to move forward is right back there, coming in from the past. We can also identify that these positions cross the planetary nodes. Well, particularly Pluto, the Saturn in Cancer is conjunct the North node of Pluto. Now I'm going to make a point, and this is not a talk about planetary nodes, and if you don't know what they are, that's okay, then there'll be other times. But basically, the moon is not the only planet to have nodes. All planets cross the ecliptic, ascending and descending. So all planets can have their history traced, like we would trace the history of the moon through the South node. That's the basic principle. Solar Fire is a very useful piece of software, as it gives you those planetary nodes very easily in just one of its reports. When we see personal nodes, the personal nodes of the moon intersect with the planetary nodes, in this case of Jupiter and Pluto, I believe, we can see that the personal story, the personal evolution of this client has connected, has cross-referenced the collective story of the transition of matriarchy to patriarchy. They have been personally involved. There may be many other ways of seeing that personal involvement, but when the planetary nodes intersect with the personal nodes, that's one very clear way of showing the archetypal themes of this person's life. We learn a lot about this lady when we realize she's from Basra in Iraq, and she's living in London, where she rings me for a reading. Given a choice, after her mum sacrificed her whole life, Neptune, Libra in the 10th, is a skip step across the nodal axis in the first 7th. The theme of sacrifice, through the culture, through the cultural enforcement, in relationships, coming through the 1st house, 7th house nodes. Given a choice to sacrifice her life to her chosen for her husband, like her mum had done, Venus, Uranus, she decided to quit town. Hannah will be talking about this revolutionary love here, but this lady moved to London to try a different life. She experimented with her bisexual feelings. She opened up to a whole new crowd of people, astrologers. But, and here's this power of this repeat, relive, she was partly ringing me to ask, or to discuss with me rather than ask, a desire of hers to return to Iraq once this conflict has stabilized. Because she felt something was missing, because she felt some sense of what it was to be at home had been missing from just leaving it. And now that through all this carnage it might actually be a more open democratic society, touch wood, something good might come from it. I'm just alerting us to these themes of matriarchy and patriarchy through planets in Capricorn Cancer, through the nodes in Capricorn Cancer. Talking to this lady about that story was such a relief for her. To just see it as an unfoldment within history, a process that has happened, a discussion, rather than just, in a way, the twisted world that she both loved and had to run away from. And I'm going to say from the Saturn point of view here that it's not as easy to biologically transcend as Uranus would like us to believe. In our Uranian moments, yeah, we get ever younger, yeah, the sun, it's made me great, but there's still this, and we're here, and Capricorn asks us to accept being here. There's been some talk about the New Age with regard to the Uranian transcendence. I remember I was at a biodanza workshop once, dancing with a lady, and the previous night she'd been talking, and she was talking about something happening in the world, and I came in with a fairly general comment. I thought, there's a lot of suffering in the world. Oh, you can't say that. If you think that, you'll just make it. I said, but it's not to do with my thoughts. If someone, bursts into someone's house with a gun and starts shooting their family, that's not my thoughts. That's something real. That's something emotional that touches people, that hurts them. Oh, she wasn't having any of it. The next day, anyway, we're covered in mud, oddly enough, and we're about to paint our faces like some sort of Amazonian jungle creature. And she comes to try and paint her face and touch her face. And I just touch her on the shoulder because I can just see it coming. And she sobs, and she sobs, and she sobs. You can't think about suffering. You'll make it happen. She just comes to touch her face when she's been through some of that, when she's presumably sat with it in some way. And she's crying like a child, crying openly, and her whole face changes. And it turns out she's been in fear of a cancer scare for years. And she's lived with that fear. But in belief terms, no, we don't talk about that. We don't do it. I think the great strength of Capricorn, and I want to stick up for it. I want to stick up for it. There's a very eminent Capricornian astrologer in the front row. And I don't know Stephen very well, but I was a student in Astro 2000 and I saw Stephen talk, and I had a little chat about having family in Wales, and Stephen said he had some too. And I thought, Stephen's a really nice guy. And I had no idea he was a Capricorn. So that's it. Why hold it against him, And I myself am a Moon-Venus Capricorn, and God, I'm terribly British half the time. I really am, I'm prudish. I'm scared if people are too open, and but I love it too. And I think that's the Capricornian dilemma. The real split's shown by these ministers, isn't it? They go and they work in the House of Commons all day in London in their sharp suits and their pinstripes, and then they have like evening breaks where they go off to some femme fatale who ties them up in rubber or whatever and beats the shit out of them. That's the split. That's when Capricorn can't share it to the side. And then they go back in the Commons the next day, and this has actually happened. One famous Conservative MP in Britain actually died autoerotically asphyxiating himself. A man who'd previously spoken out against single mums as a blight on the nation's consciousness is there in his room hanging himself just to get a better buzz. That's the split. The potential in Capricorn, can we move back just to the archetypal, the 4 things? Thanks very much. Capricorn here has the potential for maturity, the potential to own and take responsibility for the actions they have done before and that they are doing in the moment. That's the great gift of Saturn Capricorn. If we're practicing astrologers, if we can show to people where they're conditioned by Capricorn and where that conditioning might become a responsible self-act, that's a gift in itself. And this conditioning here, the negative conditioning, is the source of so many problems in society. It's the source of so much accumulated rage. The Saturn suppression, the Capricorn suppression of everything we want to do on an instinctual basis. And rightly so, to a certain level. If we had sex with every person we fleetingly fantasized about having sex with, we'd be having a lot of sex if we're anything like me. So there are certain natural limitations that occur that we all agree on. But at the same time, if these restrictions are overly enforced, it becomes a source of massive suppressed and distorted rage. And this can become very ugly indeed. On a low level, on an underlying level, and as a therapist I get a lot of this, depression. Depression as a suppressed rage. I actually feel like beating the crap out of the people that conditioned me in this way, that treated me this way. I can't get in touch with that. Instead, I just start to feel lower and lower and lower, suppressed. It's also the source of much more disturbing dark eros and violence towards self and women, suicide rates. Maurice was talking earlier and saying your Uranus transit hits and you realize you shouldn't be there in the codependent relationship. So you're up out of town. And then your partner goes to the shrink for several years, yeah? Well, I'm that shrink. I really am. And I've worked with people for years on that. And what seemed like an interesting dilemma after 6 weeks maybe does start to get a bit tiresome, shall we say, in the nicest possible way, 2 years down the line. But it's massive until we realize we've given away a fundamental part of ourselves to another person. This happens both in relationships from our projected needs and the giving away of our inner anima or animus. It also happens in our suppressed rage. Our will has been taken from us by the absent father, by the critical teacher. And we start to build an inner figure of shame where there used to be someone who was a warrior who could go out into life and do something. So much shame. Parents are so frightened themselves of separation anxiety. So many. In a world where tribe and family have been broken down into this nuclear family thing, and it's essential isolation. Nuclear family relocates somewhere. This is what my family did. Father gets a good job as a solicitor and then a lecturer in law. Mum's a teacher, they bring up kids. They've moved hundreds of miles away from their family. No one they know or love lives where they live. They have to do it all themselves. No wonder they're not there enough. And no wonder when they are there, they're tired and stressed out and hammering things around and creating an atmosphere of fear where there should be one of acceptance of the people, of the children's mistakes and their learning. So many people come to me, and in the first few weeks, a great learning for a lot of young parents in the area where I live, in a very sort of working class industrial area. They're just amazed to make the link between how critical their parents were to them and how unwittingly critical they're being of their children. I had one client recently sob for about 20 minutes in the memory of her 5-year-old getting onto a bike that was bigger than the one he had before. And she felt so anxious and helpless that he couldn't do it initially. She actually shouted at him until he cried. And when I just said, well, what was it like to feel that anxiety and helplessness? It just spilled. But that's what, in that park, in that British park, with the British people walking around, and what will people think? She couldn't connect with it. She couldn't feel how anxious and helpless she felt herself, watching her child try to make that step. It's this disowning that at its best Capricorn seeks to bring right back to home. A good Capricorn energy holds us in our responsibility. It was not this kid's fault he couldn't ride the bike. He'd been riding a smaller one before. He was really, really trying to get on it. I actually did the chair switch. I actually put her trying to get on the bike. And the shift. So, in Jungian terms, and a few people have talked about Carl Jung today, very interesting man. This is the impulse for individuation. This is the encounter with the shadow, the projected needs. The girl who made me alive and sing like I was in heaven is a hellish bitch from hell 6 weeks later because she didn't meet my needs. That's so her fault. That's our shadow we're meeting. It's nothing to do with her. Here we have the animus that he talked about, that once we had some working knowledge of our shadow, we could begin to dialogue with these inner figures, this feminine inside of us as a man, or this masculine inside of us as a woman. And here we have the archetype, at best, Capricorn at best, of the wise figure. The old man, the old mountain goat who's been up and down. You know, before enlightenment, make rice, drink water. After enlightenment, make rice, drink water. That's the wise figure. And Jung, and this is a very Uranian perspective looking on these archetypes, Jung's individuation notion, which is still pertinent today. It corresponds in many ways with the idea of individuation we have in evolutionary astrology. He gave us a lot of material, Carl Jung, on how to undertake that process. And this axis holds those major figures. And it also holds that key idea of the inner child. And that's the point I'd like to make about homeland. How many of us, even right now, know where our child is at? The one inside of us. Not the living biological. How many of us are aware, how old that child is right now? Whether they're feeling happy or frightened? I know me, when I come to these conferences, I'm quite shy, and my little child goes all, and until I've met a few people and chatted, I'm all over the shop. Is this a figure we can get on with? Is this a figure we can reach out to and touch? Is this a figure we can love? Because this is the feeling that's going to create that sense of home with others. This is the feeling that for that client of mine, this young woman all dressed in black, thick rings across her fingers, all in black. I don't think she's come a single time without grief just erupting from her. That's the connection that's going to see her able to relate to this 5-year-old boy on the bike. And the way we relate to that 5-year-old boy on the bike is the way we start to build a new humanity. There's nothing fancy about saving the world. Not from my sense of Capricorn as a true wise figure and an inner parent. This world doesn't need saving. It's us that needs saving. And this connection, this so often shamed and isolated figure, is the root of that salvation. Because culturally, in our present dysfunctional Western cultures, children are sidelined often, shamed. In England today, apart from all these Tory MPs ranting about single mums, there is at least some support for them. I worked with a man for a long time, a single dad. Could this man get a job? Could this man get a job that he was able to go and pick his daughter up, his 10-year-old daughter from school? This man was so angry. This man was raging against the machine. And can I blame the guy for that? It's sad. It's a sad state of affairs. So some of this anger held in Aries is a real response. Let's not let our spirituality and our, beliefs for a better world overcome the fact that a certain form of anger here is a right response. I'm not saying let's act violently, but let's know when something's right and when it's wrong. And I think, my feeling is that the great test of what's going to be right and what's going to be wrong is whether it checks in with that little child inside. And I think that's going to be the fundamental basis of security, which is at the heart of the Cancer archetype. This is an internal security at its strongest. If you place it somewhere else, it's always going to give out on you. Always. No matter how nice the person, no matter how much they are your soulmate. Really, honestly, they are. It's in here. Cool. How am I doing for time? Cool. Well, I'm going to close quite soon. I'm going to have a few questions and answers, and then people who have been here it's been a very long day. I'm aware of that. People want to get ready for tonight. But I'm happy to answer questions as long as. I guess I just want to say this point again. The heart of the Cancer archetype is internal security. Those fourth house transits, people with big fourth houses, the big uncomfortable ones, Pluto, Uranus. After all the trauma or all the response or difficulties have enacted, it's an internal security that's sought, comfortably present on this earth, right now. Capricorn, space and time, right now. No transcendence. Why transcend? Says the Capricorn integrated with Cancer archetype. Why do we need to transcend if we feel responsible, loving towards this child who's loving back and in that world? Why do we need to transcend? Saturn's innately suspicious of Uranian transcendence. It's like, what are you getting away from? And should you be allowed to do that? And I think we need to respect Capricorn for that. Yes, we shouldn't take on unnecessary shame and guilt over things we didn't do. At the same time, there's a certain respect I have for that principle in life. Because the times I have tried to get off my face, get out of it, run away, it's never fully worked. Okay. I'll take some questions now.
What do you make of the current configuration of Saturn in Cancer squaring the nose?
Good point. Maurice asked me about Saturn in Cancer, the present transit, and the time when it's squared the nodes. I feel, I can only answer that personally, I guess, which is, in these very turbulent times, we have a choice, don't we? Whether we can structure our consciousness, Saturn, the way we structure ourselves, internally and outside. And we have a choice, don't we? If we can develop that internal security, if we can create that sense of family or tribe with our world, then in the shift to Leo, we're suddenly a creative powerhouse. We're suddenly able to sing of ourselves in a kind of Whitman-esque yawp across the buildings, across the rooftops. We can give of ourselves, but only to the extent that we've found that connection. And I think, my personal feeling that applies politically and on a much larger global level. That same issue. That applies to nation states as well as to people.
I have Saturn going over my moon Pluto in the fourth house in Cancer. And what it's doing to me is stabilizing that inner child.
Yes.
Helping me know just where and who that inner child is. And it's been remarkable, but I've been on the spiritual path for many years.
Sure.
So this has helped me tremendously. But I feel like, like I said, I said man, but I'm a woman, but when man is unconquerable from within, no one or nothing from without can do that.
Exactly.
That's the way I feel now.
Yes.
I feel like that Saturn is really, really saying, okay, prove it.
Saturn is a very grounding transit sometimes, isn't it?
It really is grounding.
Yes, they can be hard sometimes, but they can bring you right in. And, some of the last observations here, structurally in a chart. I mean, by the way, these archetypes explain the phases very well, as Kristen was saying. But also, these are the angles of the chart. And in terms of movement, the transit of Saturn, in terms of big movements in the chart, I've personally found in my life that these angles are very, very important for those movements, for things that happen in our lives. When something moves into the fourth house. My father died within the week my Saturn hit my IC. And my mum is terminally ill now, a year away from my solar arc Pluto to midheaven. Timing in my life around these things has been very telling. And sometimes it's not news you exactly want to know about, but it gave me some sense of preparation, I guess. I think these are very sensitive points. I think a planet that's been through the 12th for a long time is rather like a soul who's been in the bardo, if you like, for a long time and is coming out again. There is a rebirth potential.
Mark, you mentioned earlier about the south and the north node of Cancer Capricorn hitting the planetary nodes.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit more, just like 2-3 minutes more about that, since there's several in the group that have that
Sure.
archetype as far as those south and north nodes.
Yeah. I think the south node of Jupiter is kind of around 10 Capricorn Cancer. Pluto's in the late teens and Saturn's in the 20s. My feeling is, my intuition is that when our personal nodes intersect those points, our personal stories from past lives have connected with that larger archetypal transition or event. And I guess it would be interesting to analyze other planetary placements on those points. So personal planets could show issues relating to that theme. For a chapter I did for Rose, I found that a number of charts linked to wars, the start of the Second World War, the invasion of Poland, the start of the Iraq War, all had incredibly intense activation on those points. I just think we may be looking at an opening there through the planetary nodes to that really fundamental time in our sort of history of our civilization when that shift occurred. And I guess it's up to us in analyzing the rest of the chart accurately to see how that works on a personal basis each time, because each chart will be unique.
On your chart there, you're showing this. Would this address both the angles and the signs? So where Aries is in my chart is sort of a beginning
Yes.
of an expression.
In evolutionary astrology, we make no distinction between the manifestations of the archetype. So Aries, Mars, and the first house all share a common archetypal thread. So yes, an ascendant in a chart, whether it's in Capricorn or Scorpio or whatever, is a beginning because it's the ascendant, but also where we find Aries in our chart, the house cusp we find Aries on, is also a beginning.
You mentioned the Saturn in the Saturn transit right now. I'm experiencing like a second death that's close to me.
Yes.
And you said you experienced that too.
Yes.
What's the lesson then? Is it just emotional maturity, like dealing with?
I've been thinking
Heavy
about
stuff?
this. I've been thinking about grief and its meaning, because I guess some part of me is in grief. And I don't know, I'll be orphaned, I guess, in the next couple of years, is my sense. And I'm going to be left with a dilemma, aren't I? Without biological parents, I guess there's an opportunity too. Daddy Sky, Mother Earth, they're more fulfilling parents on some level than mine. No disrespect if you watch this, Mum. Hi. I think grief can be quite a radical place to be in. It can make us quite authentic on some level, quite real. And in fact, there's a big theory in the men's movement that grief is very, very central for that, for the men who have been disowned by their fathers or by their culture. You know, in a country where young men went to Vietnam to fight mainly pointlessly, and in a country where, you know, so many fathers don't get to see their children. It's frightening, the statistics in Britain at least. I don't know about in the United States. Yeah, 50% of marriages end in divorce in Britain, and then something like 50% of the fathers never see their children again. In that kind of loss, there's a feeling in the men's movement that grief is actually a reconnection point for men to their feelings in a world without fathers that they could trust. And I guess I'm feeling that I'd like, you know, I'm working on the basis of inner figures, I guess, honoring the specific parents I had in this case and creating my internal world from a different basis. But it's still sad.
This is a pretty pregnant question, but being a therapist and an astrologer, you may be in a good position to answer this, but we all hear a lot about internal security, and the heart of the Cancer archetype and the
Yes.
heart of the fourth house is about this internal security. It seems very vague and elusive to me.
Sure.
Could you address this idea?
I guess I was starting to, with this idea of the inner child and actually forming this personal relationship to this sensitive, open, magical place inside us. You can't have internal security if it's made up. There's no made-up internal security. People pretend like they have it, but it usually involves an emotional disconnection. Genuine emotional security is something you test out authentically for each unique person, I guess. But yes, it does sound vague and wishy-washy sometimes, but it's a real experience. It's a genuine experience, isn't it? I remember a time in my life when the first girl I ever really fell for, kind of, you know, we weren't getting on, she'd kind of left town, and my world was just being ripped apart night after night, you know? Now, I still feel sad now for loss, but I don't feel ripped apart because there's a piece of me inside that I'm still nurturing that I haven't given anywhere else. So for me, a lot of that internal security is about claiming the false places it's been given to and bringing them back in and putting them in true places. And you can even ritualize this with clients. You can have them maybe have stones in your room or something. Take this great weight of your father's beating you and him not really being there. Take it. Now, you can have them put these things, which this is a stone for his love, this is a stone for his hate. You can even have clients put the love in their circle, in their power place, and have them reject the other. You can work quite creatively to show people how they have a power or choice to choose what stays with them. They can't change what happened, but they can change in the moment their response to it. And that becomes the basis for internal security. It's a sense, for me, of putting things in the right place. Cool, so we'll close. Thanks.